Welcome back to Outdoor Exploration. I decided to get a little jump start on today's video because I thought I'd introduce you to our lunch, where we're having our homegrown sunflower sprouts. I mean, it's just a vegan lasagna and some salad, but in addition to our sunflower sprouts, which I've been growing in the greenhouse over here, along with all our, well, a few of our sprouts for the garden this year, I am going to add some wild greens from my porch. Whoops, seed shells. And yeah, we don't have a whole lot going on in the garden yet. We just have some peas planted and the things that went in last fall. We're into month 2 of our massive list of gardening to-dos on this big paper here. But I figured today is a good day to go see what greens are growing wild for us wherever, all over the island. I'll go to a couple different places and see what we find. But first, I'm having my lunch and getting a little bit of, what's it called? Bittercress from my porch. So happily, I have this wonderful little bittercress here, as well as some dock. And I'm not going to pick the dock because it's tiny. That's an old potato stem from last year. But so this is some western dock, which I allowed to grow here and we eat during the year. But you can see it's just barely starting to get its little leaves here. So I'm not going to touch it because I would like to get a lot more before we eat it. And I will collect some bittercress. I'm not going to take too much of this because it's so handily growing right outside my kitchen door. So I'll just take some of the big leaves from the edges and hope that it keeps on growing to garnish our salads. So bittercress is a mustard, and it tastes mustardy, like that bitter kind of, well, cressy flavor. It's totally delicious in sandwiches with like cream cheese or whatever, a nice cucumbers, something fresh, and this gives that kind of peppery flavor along with it. Anyway, I'm going to add this to my lasagna now, or my salad, and eat it with my lasagna now. And I will get back to you after lunch, somewhere out there beyond the tractor sounds in the wilderness of our island. See you shortly. Okay, so I have come down to the Crippen Park meadow, and I just stopped at this lovely dead-looking Salmonberry Patch, which, if you've been here, you know lines most of the trails around here. And I wanted to point out that new life is beginning. So over here, well, all over the place, you can find tiny, tiny little buds, little green buds coming out, which will eventually become the leaves and new stalks, which will hold, of course, fresh spring leaves, which we can eat, and eventually flowers and berries. And I see the Learning Center has gotten out. So let's travel on and give them their space to play. Lots of dead horsetails, a bunch of deer poop, fertilizing for the year. Usually the places that we see all the dead plants left from last year, or the dead parts of the plants, are the places that we should be looking if we want to find them again this year. So these horsetails aren't obvious yet, but I'm guessing if I kneel down here I will find a bunch of them, starting, you know, down below the surface of the soil among all this moss and grass that's also here. So let's have a look. First thing I notice is more bittercress. So this is this mustard that I also had growing outside my front door. It's everywhere. It's an awesome time for lovely bittercress salad or sandwiches if you like that. And if I feel around, well, I'm not actually finding any shoots. Sometimes, oh, here's one. Here's one. Oh, it's a worm and a horsetail coming up. There's the worm. I'll just put him back. And see this really dark little horsetail. Now, usually you'll notice, oh, here's another one. Once you see them, once you see one, you can find more easily because they're, you know, your eyes become accustomed to looking for it. Here's another one. So if I pull out a couple of these, oh, I still didn't get much, but they do have a stem that goes further down than that. You can see all of the ones that we'll find right now have these tiny little dots on them, and they have this head in here. And so that is the male. And as I said, it comes up first. Usually well, they're not really females, but they're the leafy horsetail fronds, if you want to call them that, will be up much later actually. And these actually just come up and they have this polleny spory looking head on them, which can get quite big actually. But when they're tiny like this is the only time you can eat them. And if you watch, eventually you'll start to see these little heads come up and they'll be bitten off and they'll look like this. And that's because the deer come along and, you know, snap them off. So yeah, they're really bitter. They have a lot of oxalic acid. You will feel like your whole mouth is drying up when you eat it. I would personally call this a starvation food, but just interestingly, I find them a really important part of our ecosystem, and to watch and to see that the deer graze them and they know exactly when to take these little tips of them and nothing more. They don't eat them when they're those full, you know, brushy looking green horsetails that we're more familiar with. They only eat the tips of these little pollinating, or whatever they are, fertile heads I should say, and only in the early spring. Interesting. It just occurred to me that a lot of the time we think about walking in the wilderness and there's this idyllic ideal where people are, you know, oh, just happily, I'm going to trip trying to do this just to show you, but happily wandering along with their eyes at the sky and, you know, brushing past all the beautiful nature. And that's lovely, but especially in this season, you're more likely to find people who are, you know, really looking at nature, kind of going like this. Oh look, here's a little shoot of a salmonberry, and yeah, just walking very, very slowly and looking at all the tiny details, because, well, you know, huge things like the weather and these trees, these aren't enormous trees, but, you know, they're alders, they're pretty big. They play a large part in it. A lot of what's happening is up there, but we can't see the tiny things. I mean, there are alder catkins up there right now, which eventually, when they're big enough and when we find some we can reach, we can eat them. But really, a lot of what is changing right now is just in these tiny details. Oh, speaking of alder catkins, there are a few here on the ground. And there you go, we're looking at tiny things on the ground, even when we want to talk about what's up in the tree. So just like with the horsetails, something has nibbled off the end of this. Here's one that, oh no, it's been nibbled too, but these are all really tight still. If you look at them, they're almost look like a cone. They're so tight and small. But when they're bigger, and I'm talking like at least 2 inches long, sometimes 3 or more, they loosen up and then they become edible to us. So I don't know what's been nibbling at these right now, but some animal that wasn't human, clearly. And yeah, that's the kind of thing you can find down here. Catkins that aren't ready to eat. When they are ready to eat, they're wonderful stir-fried or baked into casseroles. Anything you can imagine doing with, like, I guess, asparagus. Lots of wood bugs in here. Piles and piles. And here's one that hasn't been eaten. It's very green looking. How beautiful. This is interesting to me. I hope you can see this. It's the remains of a tiny cone of some type. Not really sure. But it is full of little white specks, which I think must be mycelium. I don't know. It's just beautiful. Oh, you know what? I think they're actually teeny tiny white mushrooms They're not the mycelium, they're the mushroom bodies themselves. I can see tiny little stems and teeny tiny caps, and each one is less than 0.5 millimeter wide. I mean the cap, the stem is even narrower. I'll put that back. Mushroom and woodbug haven. Yeah, seriously, this is the time of year for sitting and looking really closely at the world. There's a tiny little millipede in there, a young one. You can't see a lot of what I'm finding here because we don't have a close-up zoom lens today, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting thing to come look. This is a munched green leaf. I always wonder who was eating these things, you know. Okay, let's carry on, see what else we find. Oh, a green, what's it called? Salmonberry shoot coming off of a broken branch. I doubt that's actually going to become anything, but we'll just leave it. Here's a little ditch just along the side of the meadow, and I can see, well, there are some kind of reeds. I'm not sure exactly what all this is growing up here. You see the little bits of green, but there's also an oil slick. And there was a time when I thought that meant, you know, terrible pollution, but at some point I learned that actually, usually when you're in the wilderness and you find these oil slick things, it's decomposing plant matter from down below. Well, in this case, it's all over the place here. You can actually see all of this decomposing plant matter. So then the oil from those plants comes up and sits on the surface and feeds the plants. Ooh, I'm all brown. All that nutrients, yum. Maybe not for my lunch though. Healthy oil slicks. Woo. Nice sound. Look at these bubbles coming up here. Bubble, bubble. I actually came here to point out this young, very, very young skunk cabbage here. But of course, as I walk over here, all the bubbles come up. And that reminds me of how important it is to talk about not only the plants that we can eat, because of course, we depend on food, and so we can look for things like bittercress or whatever in our environment that we can eat. But it's really important to think about the whole environment. So here we have this little squelchy, mucky, boggy creek. I'm just beside the dog park here, literally, whatever this is, 20 feet from the fence. And all these bubbles that come out from under the muck in there tell me that, just like when we saw the oil back near the horse run over there, or riding area, whatever that's called, there is plant matter decaying under here, and it's creating gases in addition to oils. And those gases bubble up when we press the ground. And then in all this, you know, muck, we call it muck, that's in here, and it won't be a nice clear creek anymore when I pull this up, but it just looks like mud. But actually, this is just a collection of dead and decaying, well, this is a piece of wood, but mostly I think leaves and maybe the what are they called? Skunk cabbage from last year. All these things. I definitely see some needles in here. You know, all kinds of things. Animals, maybe, definitely insects, but possibly other animals. It's some barred owls nest here a lot, and a few years ago I actually found a dead owlet just on the ground near here. It probably fell out of its nest. So all the things that have died over winter or in the early spring are decaying and, you know, sloughing off from the land and coming into the creek or being washed through the creek from further upstream there. And ooh, here's a caddisfly larva, I think, building its little nest and making way for life, like this caddisfly larva, who has built himself a tubular little nest out of, it looks like sand grains. You can't see him because he's nothing but that little dot at the end of the tube there, but when he's in the water, he will crawl around. He'll reach his whole self out of that tube, and well, the front half of himself, and crawl around. And then all of these things are depending on those dying and decaying things from the winter and previous years to get the nutrients that they need for their life this year. And that's our life if we're having wild plants, for example, that we find out here in the wilderness. We're also depending on all this muck and the oils and the bubbles and all of those things that are part of our ecosystem. Here's a mosquito. He keeps landing on the water, he or she. Some lichen has fallen into the water here. I think it's amazing how rich the community is. I mean, there must be just thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of different life forms all living together and all dependent on each other. And we are part of it. All right, let's carry on. What else will we find? I just discovered, oh, I thought I would pull it down, but maybe I can't without breaking it. The first, at least for me, the first Salmonberry Blossom out on the end of that branch right there. So it's March 3rd today. Oops, I'm gonna break too many of these dead little bits, but March 3rd, and I see our first Salmonberry Blossom. I'm pretty sure that's rather early, but anyway, there it is. Can you film in close to it? No. I have to know what all these ravens are on about. They're right near the recycling depot, so you know, it might be just that, but I have to go check. Well, I'm not sure. The older I get, the more afraid I am of falling, and the more careful I am. Okay. Well, I guess maybe they're just hanging out here, not finding any decomposing animals or exciting garbage or anything in particular. I don't know. And of course they all left, so rather than chase them further and further along into the woods, maybe I'll just enjoy their voices and leave them be. Oh, there's an eagle. I hear it, but I don't see it. I've always thought it was so lovely that one of the most feared birds around, eagles that is, has such a twittery, weak sounding little voice. There are always so many eagles and ravens and crows and everything around the recycling depot. It's great to watch them. Oh, and the swamp here has a bunch of skunk cabbage coming up. There's one, oh, a whole lot of it over there. How beautiful. Look what I found. It's like a meadow of skunk cabbage. Okay, it's not a meadow because it's a swamp. I hear these are recently being called swamp lanterns. Either way, they do smell like skunk in a kind of more perfumey, beautiful way. And I should point out, since I mentioned them earlier and didn't talk about them, skunk cabbage are sometimes spoken of as being edible. Personally, I wouldn't eat them because they have long crystals in them that literally would puncture your insides. So there are times that you can eat them, but I think it's too risky to guess about that. However, you will see as the year goes by, there are certain times when the deer eat them, and you'll see them munched upon, especially when they're really old and the leaves are enormous, like in the midsummer. Deer start to nibble the edges of the leaves, but they only eat a tiny little bit. Oh, and I notice growing in this swamp even is some more bittercress. It's just everywhere right now. And a bunch of algae, so many things. But here's the thing. We're literally just behind the recycling depot and the fish hatchery here in Crippen Park, and I found this gorgeous, gorgeous spot. And that just leads me to thinking about how I often hear people talk about how precious our nature or wilderness is, because it's, you know, it gives us a place to be tranquil, so much beauty in our life, and it does. I just think it's also really important that we realize that this beauty, which we can literally find everywhere, no matter where you walk into any kind of, quote, boring looking wilderness, you're going to find moments of pure gorgeousness. But more than that, this swamp is cleaning our earth and water and air for us right now. I mean, it's also making gases that go up into the air, like I talked about earlier. It's growing food, bittercress and skunk cabbage if you wanted to eat it, or if the deer eat it, but food for all the other beings that live here too, plants, fungi, animals, insects, everything. And as the water, you know, comes from, oh, I have stuff all over me, comes from various places around, it flows through swamps and mossy forest hillsides and bluffs and all kinds of places, and it gets cleaned by the dirt. And this is why we need the wilderness, not just because it's beautiful, even though that's important, and hopefully that makes us love it enough that we preserve it, but also because it's literally cleaning our water, air, and land, and providing the place for the food that we eat, and the place for us to live in harmony with all the other animals and plants and everything else that live here. That's my thought for today. I did come out to find wild greens, but most of them are really tiny, and hopefully we'll find some more in a couple weeks when I do another video. And meanwhile, look around, see what you can find, and consider its role in our health and life, and enjoy the beauty of the very early spring. Happy exploring.